In a recent video, we discussed how the rule of two was the way to go for organizing a Sith Order, and in fact, the only way to achieve stability. Since we've delivered our hot takes about the Sith, we figured we'd balance things out a little and deliver a hot take about the Jedi next. We know the rule of thumb for the Sith was that the smaller the Order, the better, but what about the Jedi? Would something like the rule of two have worked for them, and if not, what was the optimal way to organize a Jedi Order? In this video, we'll be discussing this idea in detail.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Firstly, no, the rule of two would not have worked for the Jedi at all. Unlike the Sith, the Jedi weren't self-destructive and they generally got stronger as their numbers increased, the inverse of how things worked for the Sith. The Jedi didn't concern themselves with contests of strength or competition, and ironically enough, they were much stronger for it, as their strength wasn't wasted on internal conflict. The way of the light side tended toward cooperation and balance, and so, with the Jedi, the more knights there were in the galaxy, the better, or at least that was the case most of the time. You'd think, based on this information, that the best way to organize a Jedi Order would have been by recruiting as many beings as possible. To find out if this was true, let's take a look at the era in which the Jedi were at their most numerous, the Old Republic era. In the olden days, the Jedi Order was organized much differently from what we're used to. Sure, there were still Padawans, Knights, and Masters, and a council that convened at a great temple on Ossus, but the Order as a whole was much more decentralized. Even though the Jedi pretty much had Ossus to themselves, most Jedi lived elsewhere and maintained a somewhat loose relationship with the Order and the council. This was the era of the Jedi Watchmen, a time when Jedi Knights would settle on individual worlds and become their permanent guardians, often setting up small academies to train Padawans when the Knights became Masters. In these days, the Jedi were much more open to Force sensitives, training adults as well as children in the Jedi ways. This was long before the establishment of the policy of recruiting infants as soon as they were discovered as Force sensitive, and though Jedi were still generally discouraged from maintaining ties with their families, many still did. For the Jedi skeptics out there, this certainly sounds like an ideal form for the Jedi Order, but it wasn't. There was, after all, a reason why the Jedi Order ended up centralizing and narrowing down their recruiting practices, a reason known as the Old Sith Wars. During the Great Sith War and the Jedi Civil War, the Order's more laissez-faire policies came back to bite them in the ass in catastrophic fashion. The Great Sith War saw fallen Jedi Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma become Dark Lords of the Sith. This in itself was the result of the Order's decentralization. Kun and Qel-Droma were both trained by Jedi Watchmen far from Ossus, and their falls would likely never have happened had they been trained in different circumstances. Kun's fall was largely due to how easily he was able to gain access to Sith artifacts, which was because his master had two other apprentices to keep track of, limiting his ability to keep Kun poking his nose in things he didn't understand. Qel-Droma fell to the dark side because he developed an emotional attachment to his master, something that, in those days, the Jedi didn't caution against nearly as strongly as they did in later years. Furthermore, Kun and Qel-Droma were able to recruit massive armies of fallen Jedi during the Great Sith War, many of them apprentices who had been recruited despite emotional instabilities and their advanced age. Because the Jedi Order had been loose in its recruitment guidelines and training practices, it lost thousands to the dark side and thousands more to Exar Kun's followers. Many of the greatest masters in the Order were murdered by their apprentices in a great uprising ordered by Kun, an uprising that surely would have been crushed easily if the masters weren't so spread out across hundreds of worlds. Worst of all, the Jedi lost Ossus itself to the Sith during the Great Sith War. Unsurprisingly, it was after the end of the Great Sith War that the Jedi Order began to centralize. Centralization picked up the pace after the exact same thing happened again in the Jedi Civil War. Jedi councils following the old Sith Wars deemed the decentralization and loose recruiting practices of old to have been massive failures, failures that had resulted in the deaths of trillions across the galaxy. Recruiting practices were tightened, and masters kept a much closer eye on their apprentices' emotional states. The Jedi Watchmen all but died out as the Order rebuilt itself in a new temple on Coruscant. Clearly, having too many Jedi wasn't the way to go, though neither was having a small Jedi Order. Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Order was a pretty good example of this. We'll probably catch a bit of flack for saying this, but while the new Jedi Order did correct a number of mistakes, it also made a fair few new ones and repeated some old ones too. It was a lot smaller and much more personal than the old Jedi Order had been, and it also returned to some of the laissez-faire practices of ancient Jedi, such as allowing Jedi to marry and having a far looser organizational structure. While Luke's heart was in the right place, the new Jedi Order's struggles evinced the flaws in its structure. Just like with the old Order, its laissez-faire practices caused more problems than they were worth, and above all, the Order's smaller size made it considerably weaker. In fairness, this wasn't entirely Luke's fault, since the Empire had been rather thorough in poisoning the minds of the galactic population into distrusting the Jedi. The new Jedi Order was a good example of how smaller Jedi Orders were more easily broken, as the Order's setbacks during the Yuuzhan Vong War and its near destruction in the Legacy era demonstrated. So, what was the ideal form of the Jedi Order? Well, believe it or not, it was the form the Old Order took during the last millennium of the Republic. Now, get your hands away from your keyboards. We know that the old Jedi Order made quite a few major mistakes. They allowed themselves to get far too close to the Republic and far too bogged down in Senate bureaucracy, and they really lost the plot during the Clone Wars. By 19 BBY, the Jedi Order had sunk to such a state that it honestly needed to be burned down and rebuilt from scratch. But that wasn't because of flaws in the Order's structure. The Jedi Order of the Republic Golden Age was regularly criticized for being too centralized, too regimented, and too strict in many of its practices. But as the examples of the Great Sith War and the Jedi Civil War demonstrated, all of those things were absolutely necessary. It had to be centralized to lessen the risk of Jedi straying because they just didn't have enough positive influences in their lives. It had to be strict in terms of recruiting and discipline to lessen the risk of Jedi falling to the dark side. It had to be regimented to keep dangerous ambitions in check. While a lot of people see the practices of the Old Order as extreme, consider this. If the fate of the entire galaxy quite literally depended on how well you kept your students from falling to the dark side, wouldn't you take extreme measures to ensure history didn't repeat itself? The final form of the old Jedi Order struck a perfect balance between maintaining a large number of Jedi and preventing Jedi from falling to the dark side. During the Republic Golden Age, the Order was able to simultaneously be large enough to keep the peace across a wide swath of galaxy and secure enough that falls were rare. The history of the Republic Golden Age exemplifies just how well these practices worked. Until the very end, the Republic's final millennium was a historically unprecedented time of peace and prosperity for most of the galaxy. A lot of the criticisms of the old Jedi Order stem from how far it had fallen by the end of the Clone Wars. These criticisms are almost all valid, but to judge the Order as a whole based on them is rather lacking in perspective. Most of the valid criticisms of the Jedi Order only started applying during the Order's last few decades, and it was only during the Clone Wars that the Order as a whole became deeply corrupted. For those keeping track, that's 3 years after 1,000 years of peace. Even then, most of the problems the Jedi Order developed at the end were the result of the Sith forcing the Jedi into a long series of no-win situations, something that was entirely out of their hands. For the vast majority of the Old Order's history, those problems simply didn't exist, and the Jedi were known less for corruption and more for ending wars, freeing billions from slavery, and browbeating the failing Republic into doing something right now and again. That's hardly a bad track record. So, that's our look at various iterations of the Jedi Order and which one we think was ideal. But what do you think? Are you still angry that we dared to suggest that the old Jedi Order wasn't the worst thing in galactic history? Feel free to go off to your heart's content in the comment section below. Anyways, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.